What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and it is Monday, so it's time for another episode of We Need to Talk About Whatever. And in this instance, We Need to Talk About Gorr the God Butcher from Thor 4. But before we get into that, right, one of the things that I do want to address here is the notion of comic book accuracy, because admittedly, for all you guys out there who have been torn up, and I mean like you're losing sleep, you're on social media just tweeting out a firestorm, because you're so upset that Gorr has or doesn't have head tentacles and has like a nose and that kind of stuff. I've been busting your balls. And honestly, I've kind of had fun doing it, to be honest with you guys. But let's actually have a discussion here, right? The reality here is that when it comes to characters, insofar as their physical representation from comic books being adapted into films, I don't really care. And I haven't for a long time. Like, back when the first X-Men movie came out, sure, it mattered to me. But like, that was years ago. And I've long since grown out of that. If you look, for example, or if I look at a character like Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, he's not comic book accurate, right? Wolverine in the comics is like 5 and some change. He's really, really short. And he's just really, really stocky, right? Just like this huge, bulky guy. Like, he's not, by any standard of measurement, anything close to what Hugh Jackman looks like as Wolverine. But I still love Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. So this idea that things have to be perfectly comic book accurate, to me, is nonsense. What's most important when it comes to characters being adapted from comic books into like films and TV shows is the nature of the character, right? Like, what is it that made that character who they are in the comics that you translate over? That's what's significant, because at the end of the day, it's never really the physical appearance of a character that defines them, that makes them recognizable, but it doesn't really define them. There are precious few exceptions to that being the case. Spider-Man, Superman, Batman, a few like that. But by and large, for most characters that exist out there, if you change the way they look, it would still essentially be the same, as long as the character's form and function remained the same. That, I think, was lost with the character of Gorr in Thor 4. One of the things to know is that in the comics, Gorr, this guy is an absolute demon, right? There's no redeeming qualities about this guy, right? He's not like Anakin Skywalker in Star Wars, where like he sees the error of his ways at the end and says, "Tell your sister you were right," and he goes back to the light side. That doesn't happen here, right? That does not happen with Gorr in the comics. This guy cannot be redeemed. He doesn't get fixed. There's no things go back to being okay and the guy sees the error of his ways and everything's solved. There is nothing like that for Gorr. I mean, for God's sake, there's a point in the comics when he becomes a universe. I mean, literally, like, the motivation of Gorr, like this guy's viewpoint was so extreme. The whole idea behind Gorr is he wanted to construct something called the God Bomb, where he would basically detonate it in the time stream and it would kill every god that ever has, currently does, or will ever exist throughout all of time in the universe. Now, obviously, that's an exact plot they're not going to copy over into the film because, one, it's just overly complicated, and two, it would seem a little nonsensical to the average movie-going person. And then three, they wanted to expand on the existing cosmology of gods and cosmic entities and all that kind of stuff, hence the nature of eternity as it was introduced to us. But the thing about this is that Gorr, as he exists in the film, does not feel like Gorr, and he's not really relatable in the same way that Gorr was in the comics. In the comics, one of the reasons why people loved the character of Gorr so much is because the way his story was told was tragic. It was a tragic story, right? In the comics, this guy lost his mom, he lost his wife, he lost his kids. He literally lost everything that mattered to him in his life because he lived on a really desolate world, and his people were a nomadic tribe that were highly religious, and they would pray to their gods and goddesses, and they would rarely ever answer, right? They would almost never answer. That it was one of those things where Gorr questioned the existence of all the beings in existence, right? All the gods that were out there, because if something great happened, his people would say, well, it's because the gods wanted us to have this great thing, right? Food, water, resources, and so on. But if they go days or weeks or months without finding water or food or anything like that, and people in their tribe were dying of like dehydration, starvation, the elements, and so on, then the answer was, well, it's because the gods are testing us. We're not praying enough, or something like that. And so once Gorr had finally snapped and was like, there are no gods, right? There are no gods out there. If there were gods, we wouldn't be living in this crappy place. And he was booted from his own people. Then he stumbled across basically the body of Null and one of the golden gods that had felled Null, and he realized that gods existed. Then he was vengeful. He was angry. And that's why he went on the conquest that he went on. Because it was one of those things where you could read those stories and say, how many bad circumstances have you endured in your life and you were told, well, God has a plan, right? God has a plan for all of us. Like, how many times have, whether you come from a person who's of religious convictions or not, have you been offered that explanation by someone somewhere? And your knee-jerk reaction is, if God really had a plan and if God really loved us, would things really be this crappy? Either God's not real or God's a dick. That's your response, right? That's like your knee-jerk emotional reaction. That was Gorr's reaction. And so a lot of people could really understand his visceral response to the circumstance that he was in, and then waging a war against gods across the cosmos and killing them all. Now, it wasn't just to have that kind of relatable element. Gorr was a badass. I mean, it was one thing for him to be like, I've discovered this magical sword and now I'm gonna kill every god I can find, and he dies on his first attempt. It's one thing to do that. It's another for this guy to just continually grow powerful and to actually do it, and to see him wreck Thor 3 times, and then to see Thor from 3 different eras, all of them teaming up, right? Like young Thor, present day Thor, and Allfather Thor teaming up and still not being able to beat this guy. And it took Thor from the modern era wielding 2 Mjolnirs and the All Black himself to defeat Gorr. And then eventually Gorr came back anyway because Loki, when he killed everybody on Earth, ended up setting Gorr free. Like, it's that level of just badassery, right? That I wouldn't go as far as to say that Gorr as a villain in terms of his original depiction was on par with Thanos. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. We never saw the two of them fight. There's no reason to believe he wasn't, but at the same time, the fact that he couldn't necessarily kill Thor, he could only really overpower Thor, is an indication that he wasn't really on the same level of like strength and danger as like Thanos, because Thanos could easily kill Thor. I mean, like easily, right? Like it would not be difficult for him to do. But beyond like the physical attributes and his fighting stance and the clear and present danger that he represented in terms of like death and destruction, in terms of him as like a character, just being like driven by rage, motivation, this unstoppable conviction, oh, he was very much like Thanos. And I think in the movie, that was a hugely missed opportunity. And I think it has been for some time. I understand that the Marvel Cinematic Universe doesn't want everything to feel like Thanos. They don't want every villain to feel like Thanos. But I think that Thanos was one of those rare instances in the Marvel Cinematic Universe when they actually got a villain right. When it was like, damn, this villain's really, really cool. And he's really, really interesting. He's kind of an idiot, but like he's still cool and interesting in some ways. And I think that ever since then, it's kind of fallen short. The reality here is Gorr is not a villain that I would have put into a comedic Thor movie. I never would have done that. Because even though Gorr, as he was portrayed by Christian Bale, which Christian Bale did a great job, even though Gorr is a highly dangerous villain and was shown to us, in the film as being a very serious villain that needs to be taken seriously, the comedic nature of the film overshadowed that. And so whether it was the intention of the Marvel Cinematic Universe or not, in a lot of ways, I had a hard time taking Gorr seriously. I had a hard time looking at that and saying, damn, dude, Gorr's just gonna kill everybody. You kind of knew it, but you didn't really believe it. You know what I mean? I mean, you saw him like kill a god. And so it's like, okay, so like this guy's a threat, kind of, I guess. But what would have really, really made this guy more impactful is if it had a kind of Infinity War / Endgame feel to it. Not in the sense of grandiosity. You don't really need Gorr to be in a movie where like the Avengers are teaming up to defeat him. He's not really that big of a threat. He's a Thor story, or I'm sorry, a Thor character. He's a Thor villain, and he needs to stay that way. It needs to be one of these things because the relationship between Thor and Gorr is very personal, because it's literally a battle of a guy who denies the value of gods versus a man who is a god himself. And in fact, if you read Jason Aaron's run on Thor and you read like the whole Gorr saga in its entirety, literally Thor starts to realize the value of the role he plays and the fact that like he really has just ignored people out there who are praying to him. It's like the one thing you never see in Thor comics. Like you've never really seen an instance when Thor's like, someone's praying to me for aid, I should stop what I'm doing and impart my help on them, or a portion of my power, or something like that. But when you got to that Jason Aaron run, you realize, yeah, Thor really is a god. And there are people who pray to Thor, but he never acknowledges them. That was really the idea that like Gorr was right. There was a point in Nick Fury, which is why Thor lost the ability to wield his hammer, is the basis behind all of that. So the relationship between the two is very significant. I would not have put Gorr in some team-up film, but I would have made the film serious. I would have made it a pretty serious and a pretty dark and heavy film, right? That it wouldn't be some kind of Ragnarok event where it feels like everything's coming to an end, but the film would have been a serious introspection on the character of Thor, where he basically ends up questioning everything about himself and is he really a god in any real measurable sense? Because now you've got someone like Gorr who steps up and says, people like me pray to people like you, and people like you ignore people like me. And again, sure, that was the message that was being conveyed in the film, but the comedic nature of the film took away from the significance of that. And that's why I say a film's tone is everything. The tone of a movie is everything. Imagine, if you will, if we got that. If Thor 4 was not a comedic film, if Thor 4 felt like Avengers Endgame or Infinity War, where it had a couple humorous elements here and there, but it was the almost total opposite of what it was as it was presented to us. Imagine how that would have changed the way you saw Gorr. The other thing that I didn't necessarily like about this is it felt like Taika Waititi and these guys wrote themselves into a hole with the character of Gorr. And I think, if anything, Gorr is just another instance, another reminder of how the Marvel Cinematic Universe does not know how to handle villains. They don't know what to do with their villains. You know, I get that the stories about the heroes or whatever, but I will say from now until the day I die that the villains are almost always more interesting than the heroes. They are almost always more intriguing than the heroes. They have a better backstory. Usually that backstory is more tragic. It makes them more relatable. But Gorr, like so many other villains that came before him, right, going all the way back to Iron Man 1 and Obadiah Stane, that he's just kind of a guy that's there to push the plot forward, to say, here's what Thor's doing, and then he basically dies at the end. It's a waste. It's a colossal waste. And it feels like Gorr was wasted in his entirety in this movie, that there's no reason why over the course of this film we should have had anything other than the feeling there is a better than fair chance that Odin's son is going to die. Like, Thor, Odin's son, is gonna die. Like, that's just, there's no way to walk away from that. And then when we get to the film and he doesn't die, and it's not done as some MacGuffin, right, an eternity wishing box, right, it's not something along those lines, that we're actually surprised. Like, holy cow, he made it out of this in one piece. I never expected that to happen, right? That Gorr almost appears as this overwhelming force, him traveling the cosmos, killing god after god after god. And that's the thing, in the comics, you didn't necessarily see Gorr killing all these gods, but it was the conversation he had with Thor and how easily he was able to overcome Thor that gave you the gravity of what it was that was going on, right? That Thor showing up to these locations where these gods had just been massacred, where it was Gorr telling Thor, I tortured the god of torture to the point that he actually gave up his own family, or really it was a god of torture, but he's like, I tortured a god that represents the concept of torture. The very essence of torture could not hold up to me. That's where I'm at right now, right? This person that's just, or this being that is beyond redemption, that can't be saved, that can't be fixed, right? That in a lot of ways imbues the statement of Alfred from The Dark Knight when he says some people out there aren't looking for anything like money or power. They can't be bought, bullied, or reasoned with. Some people just want to watch the world burn. That's what Gorr should have felt like, and he didn't. Instead, Gorr felt like just a guy who was there, who was doing some things, and he was pretty dangerous, but at the end of the day, you knew he wasn't gonna make it. You know, and again, that's what makes things so heartbreaking, is because I don't care about how he looks. It doesn't matter to me how he looks. Gorr could have been 3 feet tall in varying shades of pink, and it wouldn't have made any difference to me, right? He could have looked like Majin Buu from the Dragon Ball series. It would have been fine. It wouldn't have mattered. What mattered the most to me was the depiction of Gorr, the danger he represented, and how significant a threat he was. And it just didn't feel that way. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Let me know what you guys think about Gorr down in the comments section, right? Let me know how you guys felt about his character. Again, I'm not really hating on Thor 4. I get it's the popular thing to do right now, right? It's the trend to hate on the movie. I didn't think it was a terrible movie. It was not bad. You know, it wasn't like Thor 2, right? It wasn't nearly that bad. I just think this movie highlighted, more than most Marvel Cinematic Universe movies do, that they had a villain who was great, and they didn't quite know what to do with him, and ultimately wasted him. They didn't truly understand how valuable of a villain they had, and the significance of what it would mean if they got rid of him and didn't bring him back in any measurable way, or didn't do him justice in the first place. So again, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.